The records speak of a night when the South trembled when a handful of enslaved men, led by a towering giant and a quiet carpenter barely reaching his shoulder, shattered the order that had ruled their lives since birth. Witnesses described the two of them standing side by side in the smoke-lit dark, one nearly 7 feet of carved muscle, the other small, steady, and unbreakably calm. Brothers not by blood, but by choice, by survival. By the promise they made to each other in whispers when the overseers weren't listening. Men who lived through that era still argued about what they saw: how strength became strategy, how strategy became revolt, and how revolt turned into something the plantation owners never expected. Justice carried out by men they'd underestimated their entire lives. They weren't born warriors. They were shaped into them. And on one cold March night in 1865, they finally pushed back. If you're into deep, emotional historical stories told with real human grit, you're in the right place. Drop a comment with where you're watching from, and hit subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this cinematic series. We're just getting started. Shall we begin? The first time the men saw him, the stranger was walking straight through a field of burning brush, ash swirling around his shoulders like a cloak stitched from smoke and defiance, every step slow and deliberate. He wasn't tall in the way legends brag about, but tall in the way mountains imply: silent, immovable, carrying a heaviness that made the ground seem unsure beneath his boots as he approached the work camp. Men paused mid-swing with their axes, watching the stranger's silhouette sharpen through the haze, his eyes scanning the clearing with a calmness that felt unsettling in a place built on shouting and punishment. Records later mentioned the quiet tremor that passed among the laborers, the instinctive recognition that someone had walked in who didn't fear overseers, didn't fear commands, didn't fear the kind of men who enforced obedience with fists. The overseer, Wardell, stepped forward with a smirk, trying to size the stranger up, but something in the man's expression made Wardell hesitate before barking the usual threats meant to remind newcomers of their place. The stranger introduced himself as Rowan, voice deep enough to vibrate the air, yet controlled like a man who'd learned long ago that losing your temper meant losing more than any fight could cost. Wardell tried to humiliate him, pointing toward the heaviest logs at the edge of the clearing, demanding Rowan haul them alone, a task that usually required two large men grunting in tandem. Rowan didn't answer, didn't flinch, didn't bother acknowledging Wardell's smug grin. He simply walked to the nearest log, planted his boots, and lifted, exhaling once like freeing something trapped inside. The men nearby stared in stunned silence as Rowan carried the log across the clearing without stumbling, setting it down as gently as someone setting a sleeping infant into a cradle. Wardell's smile cracked, irritation flashing, because a man who obeys without fear is harder to control than one who disobeys loudly, harder to break than one who fights back with predictable rage. Rowan didn't look proud, didn't show off, didn't enjoy the attention. He simply wiped his hands, stepped into the work line, and swung an axe with a patient rhythm that unsettled Wardell further. By midday, every man in the camp understood Rowan wasn't just strong, he was steady, a different kind of dangerous, the kind that didn't advertise itself until the moment someone pushed too hard. At lunch, the laborers formed their usual clusters, but Rowan sat alone beneath an old pine tree, sharpening his knife with slow circular strokes that matched his unbothered breathing. A younger man named Ellis approached cautiously, offering half a tin of beans, not out of fear but curiosity, wondering what kind of man entered a brutal work camp like he was strolling into a tavern. Rowan accepted the food with a nod, no smile, no small talk, just the quiet gratitude of a man who understood the significance of gestures in places where kindness felt rationed. Ellis later said Rowan's silence wasn't cold but thoughtful, as if every word he didn't speak carried a weight he refused to burden others with until they earned the right to hear it. By evening, rumors spread through the camp faster than the smoke drifting from the still smoldering brush line, stories about Rowan's past, each man adding his own suspicions to the growing myth. Some said he'd escaped a chain gang, others whispered he'd once led a group of rebels through mountain passes, a man hunted for helping others rise when they were told to kneel. Wardell didn't care about rumors, he cared about authority, and Rowan's existence alone felt like a challenge, a silent insult that he couldn't tolerate in a camp already stretched thin by tension. Just before nightfall, Wardell approached Rowan's bunk, torch in hand, demanding he report to the central yard, intent on breaking the man in front of everyone to reassert dominance. Rowan rose without argument, boots touching dirt with a finality that made Ellis shift uneasily, sensing something was about to change in the camp's balance of power. Men gathered in a loose ring around the yard, some anxious, some excited, all aware that Wardell rarely summoned men at night unless he wanted blood on the dirt before dawn. Wardell tossed Rowan a shovel, ordering him to dig a trench twice the usual size before sunrise, framing the command as punishment, though Rowan had broken no rule. Rowan lifted the shovel, inspected its worn edge, then planted it in the ground with a single thrust, each movement deliberate, nothing rushed or panicked, nothing resembling submission. Wardell barked louder, trying to provoke fear, but Rowan merely continued working, the scrape of metal on soil becoming a rhythm that steadied the watching men instead of intimidating him. The trench grew steadily, Rowan working with the endurance of someone accustomed to hardship, sweat rolling down his arms, as if he were pouring himself into the ground deliberately. Wardell stepped closer, frustrated by Rowan's composure, and shoved him hard, expecting a reaction, but Rowan only steadied himself and stared back, gaze calm and unshaken. Witnesses later recalled that moment as the first time Wardell seemed afraid not of Rowan's strength, but of Rowan's refusal to acknowledge Wardell's power at all. Rowan set the shovel aside slowly, straightened to his full height, and took a single step forward, not threatening, not angry, simply making it clear the shoving would not continue. Wardell blustered, yelling for the men to restrain Rowan, but none moved. Every man in the circle had seen enough cruelty to recognize the rare moment when someone finally pushed back. Rowan didn't raise a fist, didn't roar or threaten. He just looked at Wardell with the steady certainty of a man who'd been pushed his entire life and was finished being pushed further. Wardell stepped back instinctively, his courage evaporating, and Rowan returned to his trench without a word, finishing the job before dawn, as the men silently acknowledged a shift had begun. By sunrise, Rowan had become something more than a stranger. He'd become the quiet spark the camp didn't know it had been waiting for, the kind of man who altered the air simply by existing. The work camp woke before dawn, men rising with stiff backs and dull eyes, yet every one of them kept glancing toward Rowan's bunk, wondering how a single newcomer had shaken the camp's rhythm overnight. Rowan moved with the same calm he'd carried in on his first day, sharpening his axe as morning fog drifted between the cabins like breath from ghosts who refused to leave the clearing. Alice approached again, offering a tin cup of weak coffee, his hands trembling not from fear but from anticipation. Sensing Rowan's presence would eventually force a confrontation none of them could avoid. Rowan accepted with a nod, his silence never rude, only deliberate, as though every unnecessary word risked revealing a part of himself he wasn't ready for the camp to understand. Several older men watched from the side, each bearing scars from Wardell's punishments, their expressions conflicted, hopeful at Rowan's defiance but fearful of the inevitable retaliation that always followed courage. Wardell emerged from his cabin with red eyes and a sour expression, gripping his whip like a talisman of authority, reminding himself he still ruled through fear even if his voice had trembled yesterday. The morning assembly formed, boots scraping dirt in uneven lines, yet no man met Wardell's gaze. They were watching Rowan instead, waiting to see whether he'd bow or remain unbroken. Wardell singled out a worker named Bram, a broad-shouldered man who'd endured countless humiliations, ordering him to haul rocks from the riverbank alone, a task designed to break muscle and spirit. Bram hesitated, only a heartbeat, his eyes flicking toward Rowan, not for permission but for grounding, as though Rowan's presence alone steadied men who'd forgotten how dignity felt. Rowan stepped forward without a word, lifting a second harness and placing it across his own shoulders, joining Bram in the task before Wardell could weaponize the order further. Wardell barked that only Bram had been commanded, but Rowan continued walking toward the riverbank, neither hurried nor rebellious, simply choosing camaraderie over compliance. The men watched as Rowan and Bram descended to the river, their movements synchronized though they'd barely spoken, lifting stone after stone with grim determination under the rising sun. Wardell paced along the ridge, whip snapping pointlessly at the air, frustrated that authority slipped from his grip each time Rowan made obedience irrelevant through sheer quiet solidarity. During the midday break, Rowan and Bram sat beneath a fallen oak, sharing the meager lunch ration without discussing the morning's defiance, understanding some alliances didn't require conversation. Alice joined them, sitting on the cracked trunk like he'd been invited, studying Rowan as if trying to piece together what shaped a man who didn't fear power wielded by smaller spirits. Rowan began speaking softly about reading river patterns and woodland trails, offering lessons disguised as idle talk, demonstrating knowledge learned from years wandering places far harsher than this camp. The men listened closely, recognizing the practicality beneath his calm instructions, understanding Rowan didn't share idle stories but survival strategies meant for those with enough courage to act. That afternoon, tensions thickened when Wardell forced every man to chop timber faster than usual, barking threats between sips from his hidden flask, hoping sweat and exhaustion would bury Rowan's influence. But Rowan matched the pace effortlessly, swinging his axe with relentless rhythm, each strike reminding the camp that strength paired with composure was more disruptive than brawling rebellion. Bram kept glancing sideways at Rowan's form, adjusting his own rhythm to match, discovering he could work longer without fatigue when following Rowan's controlled breathing and balanced stance. Ellis mirrored them from a few yards away, creating an unspoken triangle of disciplined movement that spread along the line like a whispered idea men hadn't dared remember. By sundown, Wardell realized he'd lost the day's psychological battle. No man looked broken despite the grueling pace, their silent unity mocking his desperate attempts to dominate. That night, Wardell summoned two deputies, men known for cruelty, instructing them to isolate Rowan in the yard and beat him publicly to reassert control before dawn's work began. The deputies found Rowan sitting beside the water barrel, cleaning his blade with slow motions, moonlight reflecting off metal as though he polished resolve rather than steel. They ordered him to stand, but Rowan didn't move, instead lifting his gaze with the quiet warning of someone who had faced worse enemies and survived without bending. The deputies hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. Rowan wasn't posturing, wasn't intimidating, he simply existed without fear, and men unafraid of pain unnerved enforcers who relied on suffering. Rowan rose only when he chose, stepping toward them with controlled strength that made the deputies reconsider whether the overseer's orders were worth the risk of provoking him. One deputy swung first, sloppy and anxious, but Rowan blocked with his forearm, grabbed the man's wrist, and twisted until the weapon clattered into the dirt. The second deputy lunged, only to be shoved backward with one firm motion, landing hard enough to lose breath but not hard enough to cause lasting injury. Rowan didn't escalate, he simply removed the threat, leaving both men startled and unable to justify continuing an ambush they no longer believed they could win. By morning, the entire camp knew Rowan had faced Wardell's enforcers and remained untouched, not because he fought brutally, but because he never let fear guide him. And in that realization, the men felt something shifting inside themselves, a quiet awakening, a memory of strength long buried beneath years of endurance, rising again like smoke from iron. The camp entered the cold evening with an uneasiness that clung to the air, every man sensing Wardell's patience thinning as Rowan's quiet influence continued spreading through the work lines like an unspoken rebellion. Rowan sat sharpening his axe beneath the lantern's dim glow, each scrape of metal against stone echoing across the yard, a steady reminder that preparation often mattered more than brute displays of strength. Bram joined him without asking, lowering himself onto the stump beside Rowan, their silence forming a kind of pact thicker than spoken vows, shaped from labor, bruises, and the shared resentment of authority. Ellis watched from a distance, arms crossed, noticing how the men in the camp began drifting unconsciously toward Rowan's orbit, pulled by the gravity of someone who carried calm the way others carried fear. Wardell paced outside his cabin with jittery steps, his flask nearly empty, trying to reassure himself that Rowan was just a man, and not the beginning of something he couldn't suppress with threats. Two deputies lingered near the toolshed, whispering sharply about Rowan's refusal to bend, their nervous glances betraying the bruised pride and quiet panic left from last night's failed ambush. The wind shifted, bringing the scent of damp earth and distant pine smoke, and Rowan lifted his eyes as if reading a message carried through the dark by forces older than the camp itself. He rose without urgency and motioned Bram and Ellis to follow, guiding them toward the far edge of the clearing where abandoned equipment lay rusted under creeping vines. There, Rowan knelt beside an old iron chain half buried in soil, brushing dirt away gently, studying its length like a historian studying the ruins of fallen empires. Ellis frowned, unsure why Rowan bothered with discarded metal, but Rowan lifted a section of the chain, letting its weight settle across his palm, as though measuring more than just iron. He explained quietly that men often forgot what chains truly meant once they stopped fighting them, and sometimes they needed to feel the weight again to understand why unity mattered. Bram stepped forward, gripping another length of the chain, realizing Rowan wasn't talking about iron, but about obedience, memory, and the invisible shackles men carried long after physical ones rusted away. Rowan wrapped a segment around a wooden post and pulled slowly, demonstrating how easily rotten foundations give way when pressure is applied by hands working in the same direction. Ellis watched in awe as the post snapped cleanly, the sound thunderous in the quiet night, as if the camp itself shuddered beneath the symbolism of Rowan's lesson. Rowan set the broken post down gently, returning the chain to the dirt, telling Brem and Ellis without words that strength meant nothing without strategy guiding it. Meanwhile, Wardell noticed movement in the clearing and stormed toward the scene, whip at his side, fueled by alcohol and the festering humiliation he blamed entirely on Rowan. He shouted accusations before reaching them, claiming sabotage, claiming conspiracy, claiming defiance where none had yet been spoken aloud, his voice cracking under the strain of desperation. Rowan turned slowly, stepping between Wardell and the other men, not aggressively but with the kind of stillness that made Wardell's whip hand tremble involuntarily. Wardell demanded immediate punishment for tampering with camp equipment, ordering Rowan to kneel, except Rowan only stared back calmly, refusing without speaking a single syllable. Men gathered once more in a rough circle, each drawn by the tension building like storm pressure, their eyes flicking between Wardell's shaking whip and Rowan's steady posture. Wardell lunged first, swinging the whip with a wide reckless arc meant to split skin and remind every man watching who commanded fear in this place. But Rowan stepped aside, the whip slicing through empty air, and before Wardell could recover his balance, Rowan caught the handle and pulled it free with one fluid motion. Wardell stumbled forward helplessly, hitting the dirt hard, scrambling up with wild eyes as Rowan tossed the whip aside without triumph, as though discarding a tool that had outlived its purpose. Two deputies rushed in, but Brem and Ellis stepped beside Rowan instinctively, forming a barrier of bodies hardened by labor and sharpened by Rowan's newfound presence. The deputies hesitated, measuring the three men standing united, realizing violence here would no longer end in a simple lesson they would have to fight men who finally believed in themselves. Wardell roared for reinforcements, but none came. The other laborers stood frozen, not from fear but from the dawning realization that something fundamental had shifted in the camp. Rowan stepped forward and told Wardell in a low voice that a man who ruled by fear shouldn't be shocked when fear stopped working, his words carrying the weight of prophecy. Wardell backed away, gripping his wrist where Rowan had seized the whip handle, recognizing that he had lost command not through force but through cowardice revealed under pressure. The moon climbed higher as Rowan led Brem and Ellis back toward their bunks, the silence around them no longer oppressive but charged with something new and fragile possibility. That night, the camp didn't sleep easily. Men lay awake listening to the whine and the faint creak of shifting structures, wondering if tomorrow would bring reckoning or rebirth. By dawn, it became clear that Rowan hadn't just challenged Wardell, he'd awakened something buried deep in every man present, something the chains had never fully crushed. The storm arrived before sunrise, rolling across the hills with a growl that felt almost deliberate, as though the sky planned to witness whatever reckoning waited inside the battered work camp. Rain hammered the roofs, turning dirt paths into rivers of mud, yet every man emerged from his bunk early, drawn by a tension that coiled tighter with each distant rumble of thunder. Rowan stood beneath the old pine tree, rain sliding down his shoulders in steady streams, his expression unchanged despite the storm soaking through his shirt and darkening the ground beneath him. Ellis approached carrying an armful of damp firewood, though the downpour made flames almost impossible, driven more by instinct than practicality, seeking movement to calm the rising unease. Bram tightened the straps on his boots, noticing how men gathered near Rowan naturally, forming a loose semicircle without discussion, as if pulled by gravity stronger than fear or habit. Wardell's cabin door burst open, the overseer stumbling out with eyes bloodshot and temper sharpened by frustration, drenched instantly as he screamed for every man to line up immediately. But the men didn't scatter into obedient formation. Instead they remained near Rowan, silent and steady, the storm masking the sound of their collective refusal with sheets of pounding rain. Wardell stomped closer, splashing mud with every angry step, whip hanging uselessly at his side since wet leather couldn't crack properly, his fury growing with each second of defiance. He ordered Rowan to step forward, voice cracking through the storm, but Rowan didn't move, remaining unreadable beneath the shifting branches and swirling wind that tugged at his soaked clothes. The deputies flanked Wardell, their uncertainty visible even through the rain, having tasted Rowan's strength days earlier and, unwilling to provoke another confrontation without absolute necessity. Rowan finally lifted his gaze, meeting Wardell's glare with calm that felt colder than the storm, a quiet challenge wrapped in stillness rather than aggression, enough to stall the overseer's rage momentarily. The wind intensified, bending trees and sending loose debris tumbling across the yard, and Bram muttered that it felt like nature refused to let Wardell regain control today. Wardell shouted anyway, demanding compliance, demanding silence, demanding obedience he no longer possessed, spittle mixing with rain as he pointed at Rowan and accused him of inciting rebellion. Rowan stepped forward slowly, every movement deliberate, rain dripping from his chin as he told Wardell that men grew tired of being treated like tools discarded when worn down. The camp erupted in murmurs, men exchanging glances they'd never dared share before, realizing Rowan finally spoke aloud what they'd carried inside for years without words. Wardell's face twisted, fury outtracing caution, and he ordered the deputies to seize Rowan immediately, though his voice shook with a fear he couldn't conceal anymore. Bram and Ellis stepped forward as Rowan's shield, their bodies forming a barrier stronger than the chains scattered across the yard, refusing to allow Rowan to stand alone. Several other men joined them, stepping out from the shadows of rain and smoke, their boots sinking into the mud as they formed a growing wall of silent defiance. The deputies froze, trapped between Wardell's frantic orders and the undeniable danger posed by a dozen determined laborers, each hardened by years of brutality and ready to resist together. Wardell grabbed a fallen branch, swinging wildly at Rowan, but Rowan caught the wood mid-swing, snapped it effortlessly across his knee, and let the pieces fall to the mud. The overseer stumbled backward, realizing the camp had shifted beyond his reach, the storm emphasizing each step he took as thunder cracked overhead like the sky was judging him. Another group of laborers emerged from the far cabins, their expressions resolute, wordlessly reinforcing the circle forming around Rowan and his allies, unity blooming even under pounding rain. Wardell shouted threats of punishment and imprisonment, but his voice lacked the authority it once commanded, drowned by roaring winds and the unwavering stares of the men surrounding him. Rowan stepped closer, explaining calmly that no one wished to shed blood, but none would kneel anymore, his voice firm enough to rival the thunder rolling through the mountains. Wardell responded with blind fury, swinging his fist toward Rowan, but Rowan sidestepped effortlessly and placed his hand on Wardell's chest, pushing him gently yet firmly into the mud. The overseer lay there stunned, soaked and sputtering, staring at Rowan with disbelief, as though realizing too late that brute authority meant nothing without the respect he'd never earned. The deputies backed away slowly, lowering their makeshift weapons, understanding the fight had already been decided by the unity forming around Rowan rather than by force. Rowan turned to the men, telling them they had the right to decide their future together, rain streaming down his face as lightning struck somewhere beyond the ridge. The entire camp felt the shift and unspoken agreement settling over them like the storm's heavy air recognizing this moment as the one where fear finally loosened its grip. Wardell tried crawling backward in panic, but no man moved to help him, his authority dissolving in the mud along with his last attempt to hold the camp through intimidation. Rowan stepped back beneath the pine tree, the storm softening slightly as if acknowledging the choice made by every man watching, the ground no longer belonging to Wardell. And when the rain finally eased, the camp stood transformed, shaped not by Rowan's strength alone, but by the collective decision of men who remembered their worth despite years of chains.